The wind shifted sometime after 11. Dry, silent gust moved through the eucalyptus by the western fence line, stirring nothing but the brittle leaf litter and an overturned food bowl. Inside the shelter, the generators hummed like always, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby for the old dogs who no longer noticed nightfall, but one did. She had been quiet for weeks, never barking, never pacing. A senior shepherd mix, thin-legged and slope-backed, with cloudy eyes that still caught movement like a fading lens. They called her Runa on the paperwork, though none of the volunteers could recall why. She didn't respond to her name, not with her ears at least, but if someone crouched low and whispered gently, she would sometimes lift her head and stare, as if trying to remember whether to trust the voice or ignore it. That night, the gate was not left open. The latch had rusted soft from years of dew and inattention, but it still held when checked. The cameras showed little, just the grainy black and white image of her lying down near the door, then gone. No scramble, no tail. Just absence where she had been. By the time they noticed, the moon had shifted behind the barn and the volunteers had long since gone home. In the morning, Annie arrived early to clean the outdoor runs before the heat settled. And she was the type of woman who always carried a hand towel in her back pocket, not for the dogs, but to wipe sweat from her brow or clean dust off the plaques by the front garden. She noticed the missing dog immediately. Her first reaction wasn't panic, it was something quieter. She stood by the empty pen for a long while, blinking toward the far fence line, as if waiting to hear something creak or move. Then she knelt by the door and placed one palm on the dirt where Runa usually lay. The ground was still warm. She didn't call it in right away. She walked the perimeter twice. She checked the latch, closed and stubborn as ever. Then she opened the back gate, the one they never used except to bring in hay. Beyond it was a dry gully bordered by ironbark and wiry grass. No dog prints. Broken branches. Just the wind, gentle now, lifting little curls of dust from the path. By 8:30, others had joined her. They swept the shelter grounds, called out softly, checked behind bins and under trucks. Runa was gone. Maybe a coyote spooked her, someone suggested. But Runa hadn't spooked in weeks. She hadn't flinched when the new retrievers barked. She barely turned her head when they bathed her. She had bad hips, Annie said quietly, more to herself than to the others. She couldn't have gone far, but she had. Later that morning they received a call from a ranger who'd been clearing trail brush by the old cemetery, not the formal one by the church road, but the forgotten patch east of the reservoir, where settlers had once buried stillborn cattle and children in unmarked plots. A strange place for anyone to be walking. Alone, he said he'd seen a dog. Not a stray. Not wild. She walked like she knew where she was going, he said. Didn't run, just looked at me once, then kept moving along the fence like she'd done it before. They asked him to describe her. He said she had a scar along her hind leg, like a rope burn, and a collar so faded it looked like raw twine. Annie's breath caught. That collar had belonged to someone. They had kept it on her, even though the tag had long since corroded. I didn't follow, the ranger added. Didn't seem right. No one could explain how Runa made it that far. The terrain wasn't easy, steep, thorny, unfamiliar, but when Annie drove out later that afternoon and stood by the reservoir fence, she saw something strange. Dog prints in the dry grass. A trail, not erratic or scattered, a path. And then, further up, something older, a faint dip in the land where the soil seemed disturbed. She knelt again. This time she didn't touch the earth, just stared. The light was thinning, and somewhere in the distance a hawk screeched once, sharp and brief. There was no sign of the dog, only a cracked collar buckle lying half buried in the dust, half turned like someone had left it there on purpose. Annie didn't pick it up. She just stood and watched the wind fold the grass back over it. She whispered the dog's name once. Runahand waited, not expecting an answer. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving up the hill, not fast, not fearful, a shape pausing by a row of stone markers where no one had walked in decades. And just before the light faded completely, the figure turned its head, not toward her, but toward one small grave in the shade, as if remembering something not yet fully forgotten. And then it disappeared behind the ridge. The breeze was warmer now, rising off the reservoir like breath from something long asleep. Annie stayed by the fence until the shadows lost their edges and the ground turned the color of old ash. The hill where she'd seen the shape, a slow, deliberate figure in motion, was quiet again. Just pale grass bending, a few wags picking through dry seeds, and silence that didn't feel empty, but watching. She returned to the shelter after dusk, not because she believed Runa would be there, but because the others needed her to check. Habit was part of it, but there was something else, something about how the collar buckle had sat in the dirt, not discarded but arranged, facing east like it had been placed with purpose, as if the dog hadn't lost it, as if it had been left behind. Inside the shelter, the dog stirred as she passed, not out of hunger or fear, just the low recognition of movement. Familiar boots, the soft hiss of her keys. In Runa's empty pen, the blanket was still bunched where she'd slept, the folds marked with the faint outline of a curled body. Annie didn't move it. She crouched slowly and ran one hand along the steel gate, fingers brushing the latch again. Still stiff, still locked. That night, she slept in her car under the corrugated awning near the supply shed. The wind came and went, and once or twice she thought she heard a bark, sharp, distant, but it could have been a coyote from the ridge. At sunrise, when the light poured gold across the western fields, a small shape moved near the far tree line. Not a dog. A fox, thin as a stick, turning twice before disappearing into the scrub. The world went quiet again. By mid-morning, the ranger called a second time. "She came back," he said, "but not to me." He sounded unsure, almost reluctant. Annie met him at the trailhead just before noon. He didn't talk much, just led her with slow steps through the thistle and knotted roots, back toward the cemetery. The grass grew differently here, not wild but low and flat, as though something had been brushing through it again and again. "She was lying here," the ranger finally said, pointing toward a patch near the smallest grave. "I didn't approach, but she was facing the stone, not sniffing. Just still." Annie stepped closer. No paw prints, no waste, no fur snagged on brush, but the soil had shifted, not dug but worn, like something had settled there for hours. She walked around the grave, reading the marker out loud under her breath, more a whisper than speech. The name was unreadable. Weather had long since peeled the inscription back to a smear of lichen and dust. But beside the marker, under a flattened patch of dry daisy stems, she saw it, a shallow depression, half the width of a dog's body, circled by faint drag lines, and pressed in the center, nearly imperceptible, a pattern of soft splayed pads. No claw marks, no urgency. "She lay down," Annie murmured. The ranger nodded once. Then, as if the landscape was shifting its own memory, a scent moved in the air, something faintly familiar. Not decay, not fur, paper and rain. Annie turned slowly and saw a torn piece of envelope caught under a stone. She pulled it free and found a brittle collar tag inside, the old kind that used to be made of anodized brass. It was cracked down one side, the hole twisted, but she could still make out part of a name. L.A. Not Runa, not even close. She held the tag against her palm and stared out toward the reservoir, where a line of birds traced the sky in quiet motion. "She wasn't running from anything," Annie said softly. "She was returning." The ranger didn't answer. He just looked past her toward the tree line. And that's when they saw the second set of prints. Fresh. Smaller. They led not from the grave but to it from the far side of the cemetery, down the slope, over the narrow ridge where brush had grown thick with thorns. The depth of the prints suggested age, not young but not old either. A lean dog, unfamiliar gait, a limp maybe, or a hesitation in the front right leg. They were too recent to belong to our UNA. Annie followed them until they vanished in a patch of gravel where nothing held shape. But something else lay there. Not fur, not waste. A single coin, polished American, old and warm to the touch. Though no sunlight reached that place, she stood very still, the coin resting on her fingers like a question. "Another dog?" the ranger asked. "No," Annie said, "or not yet." She didn't explain what she meant. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the long grass toward the west. No birds moved now, no insects buzzed. The place had gone still, not peaceful, not hostile, just waiting. They left the coin behind, and as they walked away, the ranger glanced back one last time. "The pen was locked," he said. Annie didn't reply. But in her jacket pocket, the old brass tag made a small, weighty click, the kind of sound that wasn't meant to be heard, only felt a reminder. A tether. And somewhere out beyond the cemetery ridge, something moved again, slow, deliberate, out of sight. The sky had shifted by the time Annie returned the next morning. Gray clouds had moved in low and heavy, as if the hill itself were holding its breath. She walked alone past the rusted fence where she'd seen the collar. The earth was dry now, but the wind had changed, cooler, sharper. She carried nothing but a folded towel in her hand, not to wrap the dog, not yet. Just habit. There was no sign of the shepherd. The cemetery ahead was mostly forgotten, just a scatter of leaning stones and matted grass. Annie moved slowly, scanning the earth as if it might whisper something back. The prints were harder to see now. The trail, if it ever was one, had softened overnight. But there, under a thorn bush leaning toward the graves, was something strange. A depression in the dirt, smooth and round like a body had once lain curled inside it. She knelt again. The scent was faint old fir dust and something metallic. Beneath she reached down, brushing aside the leaves, and found a patch of disturbed soil. Then, beside it, almost hidden under dried petals from the bush above, was something glinting faintly. It wasn't a dog tag. It was a small, rusted key, one of the thin, outdated types that opened old gate locks. She turned it over in her fingers, recognizing the weathered shape not from the shelter, but from the narrow tool shed behind the original house, the one that had burned down 15 years ago. She stood slowly, unsettled by how the key felt in her hand. As she pocketed it, a movement caught her eyes, something limping through the distance, far beyond the ridge. Not fast, not hiding, just moving with purpose. The dog, still alone, still walking, but it wasn't the same gait. Runa's stride had changed. There was a new stiffness in her back leg, a small drag that hadn't been there before. An injury. Maybe. Annie narrowed her eyes. No predator could have gotten this close unnoticed, and yet something had changed overnight either inside the dog, or just outside their sight. She followed, careful not to call out, letting the rhythm of Runa, the steps guide her. The trail led down through a narrow channel of dry brush, into a hollow where water sometimes pooled in winter. There was no water now, only cracked earth, and, in the center, a single overturned crate. Not recent. The wood was splintered and gray-stenciled with faded letters from some long-defunct shipping company. But what mattered wasn't the crate, it was what sat next to it, a folded tarp, and under it, a shallow bed of old straw. Not wild straw, packed, shaped, as if something or someone had once meant for a dog to rest there. Annie knelt again. The straw still carried the faintest scent of sweat and pine tar. Her hands trembled, just briefly, as she brushed it aside and uncovered an old plastic bowl, the kind they used before stainless steel. There were scratches inside, claw marks. Not new. Behind her, the wind rustled through dry leaves like someone whispering that evening. Annie sat with a ranger who'd seen the dog 2 days before. She asked him to describe again where Runa had turned toward the hill. He pointed at the map, then paused. There used to be a cabin out that way, didn't there? He asked, tilting his head. Before the flood. Annie nodded slowly. It belonged to a man named Lowell, volunteer long before my time. She remembered the name from a faded plaque in the shelter's old hallway. In memory of Lowell, the ones who remember. No photo, no date, just that they said he buried his dogs out there. Every one of them. Same hill. The ranger hesitated. Was she one of his? Annie didn't answer, not with words. She drove back alone, past the ridge where she'd seen the dog limp away, parked near the edge of the hill and walked the last stretch on foot. The clouds had settled into dusk by then, and the trees stood still, listening, and there, by the farthest grave and marked sunken covered with dry leaves, she saw her. Runa stood beside the mound, head low, tail still, not collapsed, not resting, just waiting. Her ears flicked once as Annie approached, but she didn't move. The air between them was silent, and when Annie stopped a few feet away, the dog turned not toward her, but toward the grave, nose dipping as if scenting the ground one last time. Then, gently, deliberately, she lay down, not curled in pain, not tucked in fear. She placed her chin on the earth and closed her eyes, and Annie, suddenly unsure if she was witnessing something old or something new, felt the towel slip from her hand. The breeze rose softly behind her, bending the grass in waves, and in that quiet, in that fading light, the grave did not feel empty. The ground held the silence like a secret. Annie didn't return to the shelter that night. She sat in her truck until the sun slipped below the ridge, casting long shadows from the headstones where Runa had vanished. The collar buckle still lay in the dirt behind her, catching the last light like a shard of bone. No movement stirred. In the cemetery now. Not the hawk, not the wind. Just the stillness of dry leaves barely shifting across weathered graves. But something had changed. She noticed it the next morning when she unlocked the shelter gate and the other dogs didn't bark. Not at first. Not until she crossed the threshold and the scent hit her faint, familiar, but sharp. Dried blood, sweat, soil. Not panic. Just alertness. The way dogs grow quiet when they know something has happened outside. Their language. She followed it to the empty pen. The bedding had been dragged to one side. A torn edge revealed a spot of matted fur near the corner, and something else, a smear along the wall. Not from violence, from contact. A flank brushing as it turned. It was recent. The others confirmed it. The latch was still shut. The gate had not been opened. No footage, no tampering, but something had returned. Or visited. Midday. The ranger had called again. He hadn't seen the dog this time. Only Prince Fenta now, lighter in stride, as if the weight behind them had diminished. He said something else, too, something he hadn't mentioned before. There's a trail of toys. What kind of toys? Annie asked. Old ones, fabric, things, strings, broken bowls, all arranged, like someone dropped them on purpose. The team went out after lunch, following the line from the cemetery into the bramble-covered valley that sloped toward the riverbed. It hadn't rained in weeks, but the air held that odd heaviness, as if the sky were considering it. They found the toys one by one, sun-faded, brittle, chewed nearly to dust. Shelter toys, some long gone, lost years ago during floods or transport, some that had never even made it to the pens. Each one lay precisely along the route, back toward the hills. It made no sense unless some dog had been carrying them one by one, along a remembered path, not toward safety, but toward something older, a memory maybe, or a grave. Then they found the tracks again, different this time, a second set, newer, sharper, larger, wild, coyote, possibly too, fresh. The spacing between the paw prints was tight, deliberate, no chase but a following. Annie crouched down, brushing the dust lightly from one print. Her hand trembled. Runa wasn't just moving. She was being watched, back at the shelter. She pulled the files, the intake records. Runa's were thin, just A scanned form half faded with a date scribbled in pencil from nearly 5 years ago. It listed her as a stray, found near a collapsed barn off Turner Ridge. No tag, no chip, no known owner. But Annie saw something in the photo clipped to the corner, something she hadn't noticed before, behind the dog. In the background was a child's swing set, rusted, partially fallen, and pinned to one leg of it was a ribbon, blue, the kind they used at county fairs. She stared at that photo for a long time. Then, without telling anyone, she drove back to the ridge. She passed the trailhead, the cemetery, and kept going, climbing until the road turned to gravel. Beyond it, open field, wind-battered and ochre. At the far end, just as the picture had hinted, stood what remained of a swing. One chain snapped, one seat still hanging, the ribbon was gone, but the post still bore the scar where it had been nailed. The barn was caved in. Thorn bushes had swallowed most of the path, but the dog prints were there again. Not new, not old, mid-weight, still moving. She walked carefully, not calling out, just listening, and that's when she heard the yelp, not sharp, not pain, just short like breath caught on something unexpected. She froze. From the brush came a rustling, deliberate, unhurried, then silence. Then another sound, not canine. A low growl, guttural, dry coyotes, at least one. Maybe more. Her fingers closed around the flashlight at her hip, though it wasn't yet dark. She stepped back once, twice, then paused. A flash of fur moved behind the wreckage, light tan, not RUNA. Then, just beyond the swing, a shape emerged. The dog walked with a limp, now front leg stiff, dragging slightly in the dirt. Her head hung low, not from exhaustion, but from focus. Her muzzle was stained dark along one side, not blood. Sap, maybe, or something else. Her collar was gone. She didn't look at Annie. She didn't run. She simply stepped around the brush, crossed the slope, and lay down in front of the barn's collapsed door like she had returned to something forgotten. And then, from the brush behind her, two smaller shapes emerged, low, lean, cautious. Not Coyote's pups. Not hers. Annie stayed frozen. The pups approached slowly, belly to ground, ears tight against their heads. Runa didn't flinch. She didn't lift her head. She let them come. One nestled against her shoulder, and then, in the breeze that came up from the valley below, Annie caught the smell again, dust, cedar, and something faintly metallic, like old chain. She didn't move, didn't speak, and just as the light began to tilt west, one of the pups turned to look at her, not with fear, but with something colder, older. Recognition. Annie didn't move for a long time. The breeze stirred the dry grass at her feet, brushing it softly against her boots, but the dog didn't lift her head. The pups, neither hers by blood nor by bond, remained close, their thin bodies pressed into the warmth of her side, as if they'd known her longer than time allowed. It wasn't maternal, not in the human sense. It was something else, protection, born of presence, not origin. Perhaps they'd followed her scent through the hills, or perhaps she had led them here, not as a guardian, but as a witness to their start. Annie's throat tightened, not with sadness, but with something quieter, understanding. Whatever Runa had been looking for, she'd found it in this ruin, a place buried beneath memory, where ribbons once hung and laughter had long since faded. She hadn't escaped the shelter to be free. She had returned to finish something alone if she had to. Maybe she'd once belonged to the child who'd lived near this barn. Maybe the swing had been theirs, or maybe it didn't matter. Some dogs remember by smell, some by path. Runa had remembered by silence. Annie stepped back, careful not to break the stillness. There was no need to call her number. Leash could guide what Runa had already chosen. This was not a rescue. It never had been. Overhead, the sky deepened into a pale slate. A hawk wheeled high, its wings catching the last warmth of the day. The pups didn't watch it. Only Annie did. When she turned to leave, the wind picked up again, this time softer, almost warm. It moved across the slope, lifting a curl of fur from where Runa had lain earlier, sending it tumbling gently across the dry earth until it settled beside a long-forgotten collar buckle, half sunk in dust. She didn't pick it up. Some endings don't need markers, just memory.